most attended conferences that we've had in quite some time, at least in my memory, with 255 pre-registered attendees and over 100 speakers. It's now my pleasure to introduce Carol, who is the president of InfoCult and InfoSec. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for this introduction. I'll just take a few minutes to talk a bit about InfoCult, InfoSec. InfoCult was founded in Montreal, Canada, Quebec in 1980 by Mike Croppel. Mike is actually the acting director general of our organization. InfoCult is a non-profit charitable organization. We offer information and help with regard to groups, their ideology, their functioning, as well as the interpersonal relationship within the cultic context. InfoCult is founded in large part by the Quebec government, Ministry of Health and Social Services, as well as by the generosity of individual donors. We are also able to provide our services and activity in great part with by the generosity of our volunteer people. InfoCult houses one of the largest libraries in North America with documentation that spans from critical or group generated information, and we have thousands of files, journals, newsletters, government and legal documents, academic report, as well as thousands of books. Over the years, InfoCult has become widely recognized for many of its services, especially for its expertise in assisting families and individuals affected by cult-related problems. For almost 20 years now, we have had the pleasure of collaborating with ICSA in organizing the annual conference, and for us it is a natural relationship because we share the same view. While I would like to end my little allocation to you by simply mentioning that InfoCult offers services in both languages, in French and in English. Thank you.
And that, of course, was Carol Tremblay. I apologize for leaving off the last name. And thank you, Carol. It's Canada funds this service and also has Justin Trudeau. It's really unfair. ICSA gets no funding, and I'm not going to comment. So I'm very pleased to introduce today's plenary speaker, Rod Dubrow-Marshall. Rod is a PhD and is a professor of psychology and is a visiting fellow at the Criminal Justice Hub in the School of Nursing, Midwifery, Social Work, and Social Sciences. Is there anything else? Be a baker or candle maker? At the University of Salford and of course, the United Kingdom. Rod is a social psychologist who's been researching the psychology and ideology of undue influence and cults or extremist groups for over 20 years, and he has developed a totalistic identity theory as an evidence-based theory to explain and tackle ideological extremism and ideologically driven violence. He is also an active researcher in a variety of other areas, including organizational behavior and healthiness, the social psychology of identity and prejudice, and public policy and education. A graduate member of the British Psychological Society, Rod is a member of the board of directors of the International Cultic Studies Association, and is also chair of the ICSA Research Committee and Network, and he is co-editor of the International Journal of Cultic Studies since its inception in 2010. In 2006, he was awarded the Herb Rosedale Award, jointly with Dr. Paul Martin, for their psychological research on undue influence. Rod also co-founded the Reentry Therapy Information and Referral Network, Return, in the UK, in 2004 with Dr. Linda Dubrow-Marshall, where he serves as a consultant in helping individuals and families who have been adversely affected by destructive or damaging cults and other extremist and high-demand manipulative groups or relationships. He operates out of offices in Pontypridd, Wales, and Buxton, Derbyshire. Derbyshire. Rod has also served on more than a dozen governing boards of schools, colleges, and universities. Apparently, he's a governing board hopper over the past 2 decades. In addition, he is also an experienced senior leader and manager in higher education, and having served for 15 years in the roles of Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Derby, Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston, and as Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of South Wales, and Dean of Applied Social Sciences and Humanities at Buckinghamshire New University. So, with no further ado, Dr. Rod Marshall.
Well, I'm very pleased to be speaking to you all this afternoon in this closing plenary about the spectrum of coercive control. And I want to start by that troubling issue in the cultic studies field, or at least what's seen as troubling sometimes, which is that whole issue of terms and definitions. I spend a lot of time in academia. I do practical work as well, with people, as Steve said, but a lot of work in academia. We're obsessed with terminology. It's our kind of bread and butter, and I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. But in terms of the International Cultic Studies Association, and this is my 20th year of coming to these conferences, so it was 1998 when I came to Philadelphia in the US for the first time to the American Family Foundation. And over the years, I've learned that actually what we're investigating, what's concerning us, the groups that many of us have been in, go by a variety of different names or descriptions. Our experiences go by these different descriptions, whether it's cults, sects more commonly in Europe, extremist groups is another term, abuse, psychological violence. I won't read the whole list, but the point is that sometimes it's difficult to say, well, for one person, the term cult is the right term. For other people, they prefer social movements, new religious movements. Other people prefer radicalization. And of course, that may depend on the discipline. It may depend on their experience and focus. And of course, for us in ICSA, a lot of our work is around both prevention, exit work, recovery work, support for former members, support for families, community work, etc., etc. And the terms will mean different things to different people. So in one sense, we may be troubled sometimes by that terminology or that range of terms. But I'm actually putting out there this afternoon that diversity is actually something that can be liberating. It reflects actually a real spectrum of experience and interest that's both overlapping and relating. And that's something that actually should be, in my view, celebrated and embraced. In terms of bringing all of that together, as Steve has mentioned, I'm very proud that the University of Salford in Greater Manchester in the United Kingdom, we have brought that all together in the first ever master's programme that looks across the board at coercive control, both in cults and extremist groups, but also in domestic settings, domestic violence. It looks at it in the form of trafficking, human trafficking, and also gangs, and it also looks at it in the context of radicalisation and terrorism. And to my knowledge, that's the first course that's doing all of that. I'll tell you something, I don't want it to be the only course. I really want this course and courses like it to proliferate all over the world, and I pay tribute also to those colleagues that have delivered courses in other programmes and are still doing so. So this is not the only course, but what we have done is to embrace that breadth in terms of that definition of coercive control, and the theme of the conference next year in Manchester in Salford that we'll be talking about later on also embraces that broad theme. When I first got involved in the cultic studies field over 20 years ago, like a lot of people who are new to the field, this was the stereotypical representation of cults that I thought of when I said what a cult. It was either Waco or it was Jamestown or something like that. And when I came to my first conference in 1998, I actually didn't realise, I hadn't had the realisation that I'd been in a cult myself, because this was the type of cult I was a member of. These are some of its predecessor groups, actually, the Workers' Revolutionary Party being one of them. I remember in Minneapolis, St. Paul in 1999 listening to Dennis Tarish, who's a great writer and speaker, talking about democratic centralism, the Marxist Leninist theory of party building, which I could bore you for hours with if I had the time, but I won't do that. But the point is that I didn't realise, I hadn't connected those dots, which so many people don't do, but about the fact that the abuse that I had suffered, the effect on my career, on my family. I recruited my own sister into the group, that actually I had been in a damaging cult, but it was a political cult. And that's where variety is really important. And Margaret Singer and Yanya in Cults in Our Midst outline that breadth. And I've actually been, like many in the room, talking about that and teaching about it ever since. The fact that cults come literally in all shapes and sizes, but also ideologically span the full range from religious groups through political groups, through groups that have no discernible, recognisable ideology at all. And with that appreciation of diversity comes, I think, an appreciation that there's a diversity of experience, there's a diversity of modus operandi, and also of harm. And I quote Michael Langoni from 2005 when he said that some groups, under some circumstances, harm some people. The fact that the harm that people suffer is different according to the situation. Some people harm more than others, and we need to investigate that. That diversity, of course, is part of recognising that influence is not necessarily a bad thing. We're being influenced now. I'm arguably, I suppose, trying to influence you, although I'm always kind of uncomfortable doing that after my experience. But social influence is literally everywhere. It's in any room, in any meeting, in any interaction. I'm always at pains to remember that when I'm teaching in education that that's also, of course, a form of influence, just as our personal relationships, either adult partnerships or indeed between parents and their children. And again, from Cults in Our Midst, a really great table that I won't dwell on, but which showed education, advertising, maybe even propaganda, legitimate forms perhaps of communication and influence, whereas indoctrination and thought reform are most definitely not. And the 8 themes of thought reform that the great Robert J. Lifton has developed, I think, is still a really great way in which to test the question as to whether this is coercion that one is suffering or that other people are suffering across the context. Yes, of cults and extremist groups, but also that spectrum of coercion across domestic relationships, trafficking and gangs. In cults, many people will have seen this very moving quote when you've met the friendliest group of people you've ever known, who introduce you to the most loving group of people you've ever encountered, and you find the leader to be the most inspired, caring, compassionate and understanding person you've ever met. And then you learn that the course of good is something you never hoped could be accomplished. Then it all sounds too good to be true because it is. And that's, of course, the experience that many of us as first generation cult members went through. The falling in love with the group and its ideology and its leader and its members, only to realise later that you've been conned, abused, swindled and deceived. And this, of course, was a quote from Jeannie Mills, who was later murdered after she left the People's Temple. ICSA and cultic studies and then all the work, that spectrum of coercion, of course, has developed hugely over the 20 years that I've been involved. And one of the key areas of development, of course, is for those people who didn't get conned into joining, but actually were already being brought up, were being born and raised in sects or cults. And then some great books that have been published in recent years by Lois Campbell, Annie Lardich, and of course the very important workshops that ICSA is doing, including the one next April in Connecticut, I think, that's happening. So that breadth, realising, of course, that many people grew up in cults, grew up in sects, grew up in extremist groups in this country and across the world, and therefore that the familial, the family aspect of that is also very important, which demonstrates immediately the relevance, as we've seen in a number of panels of this conference and previously, with the context of domestic and familial abuse. And the importance of recognising that when we talk about coercive control, when we talk about coercive persuasion, this is often happening within that context of families. Predominantly men, but women too sometimes. The Mankind Initiative from the UK is a group that does work specifically for male survivors of domestic violence. Big growth of support networks and groups to help survivors. Another example there. The context, of course, for this is the fact that some of us may have thought, as we approached the turn of the century 18 years ago, that some of the battles for women's liberation against women's oppression had been won. Sadly not. It's very clear in this country but across the world that those battles are still highly relevant and that the oppression facing women, as the slide shows and other data shows, is significant. And in that sense, coercion within family relationships is absolutely a critical area of work on that spectrum of coercive control. In the UK, we've been fortunate to have the Serious Crime Act of 2015 that defined controlling and coercive behaviour. And for the first time in UK law, what this did was to define it in psychological terms. In other words, psychological violence or psychological abuse can be now the grounds for prosecution. And a number of cases have been successfully prosecuted through the UK courts in intimate relationships where women, usually there's been one case of a woman that's also been prosecuted for controlling and coercive behaviour to her male partner. But those cases have allowed psychological abuse to be prosecuted before it gets to physical abuse. And so many times, we've heard it from presenters at this conference, it's only when the physical abuse happens that the help is there from the authorities. Now we have a law in the UK, I hope we have other laws here in the US, I know work is being done on that, that defines coercion within families precisely in that psychological way. This is an important breakthrough I think we've got in the United Kingdom, and a law that we must use more in bringing perpetrators to justice. The definition of coercive control in the Act rests very much on Evan Stark's work, a professor of social work, I think, here in the United States at Rutgers, and he wrote the seminal book in 2007, Coercive Control, How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. And interestingly, in that book, he explicitly compares coercive control, and here's the quote, to coercive persuasion, brainwashing, and other tactics used with hostages, prisoners of war, kidnapped victims, and by pimps with prostitutes. Well, I pay tribute to Evan Stark's influence on the field, even though he's not presented at our conferences, hopefully he may do in the future, but also the fact that he has that understanding from a different area of all that we've been working on for so many years, that coercive persuasion doesn't exist in those boxes and boundaries that academics sometimes choose, or that people choose because that's their experience. It pervades families, it pervades communities, it pervades groups, and he understands that and has influenced, as I say, in a positive way, the development of the law in the United Kingdom. What he also does is to point out that the violence inflicted on women in domestic relationships is also ideological. It's easy to say, oh, that's just between individuals, there's no ideology there, but it rests on the notion of patriarchy, and the way in which patriarchy is still embedded and embroidered within society. The fact that women across the world are still subjugated to violence and disadvantage, are systematically oppressed across countries. That's an important understanding, and relates, of course, to the growing movement online, legitimised by some in high power, of male sexual entitlement. The idea that men have this reason to feel that they should always have sexual gratification of some kind, and this is a very obnoxious ideology, but it's also one that fuels domestic violence. So our work, I think, has to, in that sense, understand and embrace and get behind those movements that are looking to redefine gender more authentically, that are looking to create authentic relationships, authentic definitions of gender for both femininity and masculinity, and that are opposed to all forms of oppression of sexuality and the alienation that so many children face when they're growing up with regard to their gender and their identity development. The roots often, not an excuse, but the roots for the violence that we then see perpetrated later on by some people. So Evan Stark's work is really important. It frames, as I say, the Serious Crime Act and the importance of the fact that this happens over a period of time. It's not single acts, but nevertheless, that single acts can be grounds for taking action against the individual. It's not each behaviour on its own is automatically a criminal offence. The case still has to be made, but it does allow for cases to be put together with regard to psychological abuse. I add here, of course, that this is in the context, particularly in Europe, but I know it's the case here as well, of honour-based violence and the scourge of female genital mutilation, which is a terrible crime, I believe, against young women worldwide, and is justified, of course, as so much abuse is on religious grounds or cultural grounds, and there are many great organisations doing work to stop that, and indeed to stop forced marriage, distinct in that sense from arranged marriage, but forced marriage, which is also sometimes justified on cultural grounds. The types of controlling and coercive behaviour, when I read the series Pine Up for the first time, I thought, they must have been reading Cults and Our Myths, or they must have been reading Combating Cult Mind Control, or they must have been reading one of those great books, because honestly, the things that are in there, isolating the person from their friends and family, depriving them of their basic needs, monitoring the type, sounds familiar. To all of us that have been in cults, it sounds very familiar. Taking control over aspects of their everyday life. Saying where people can go. These are the core features, of course, of coercion within domestic relationships, but are very much in common with the milieu control that Robert J. Lifton defined, putting people down, the use of language, enforcing rules which humiliate, degrade, dehumanise the person. And then, of course, within the Act, it does also define physical violence as well for when it gets to that point, including criminal damage and, of course, rape as well. What we've been doing is to redefine and use Lifton's definitions of thought reform to define how coercion and coercive persuasion, coercive control works within different settings. So in that sense, milieu control is knowing where the person is all the time, controlling their movements. It's all about him, usually him, sometimes her as well. I must try harder for my partner because they're never satisfied. I'm so sorry that I've failed you again. These are the things that people go through in domestic relationships. The notion that I owe this person everything, how could I possibly be without him or her? And the dispensing of the person's existence. He, she, the person, the partner, is the existence, and that's how that control becomes ultimately totalistic for the person. So I think it's been a real growth of ICSA and other organisations, the fact that we've grown to understand that coercion in families, coercion in relationships exists with the same aspects of psychological control as exists within group settings. And another key context, which we've had some great speakers at this conference this year and in previous years, is to do with what sadly is huge increases in trafficking and also forced migration. Pictures there from Europe of the boats that are regularly sailing across the Mediterranean Sea, often sinking before people who are migrants, refugees from Syria or from Iraq can get to safe harbour. The fact that gang leaders and pimps specifically target the population for their own benefit, which is just unconscionable, reprehensible. And in the talk yesterday, there were some very disturbing facts said specifically about sex trafficking. I've got some statistics up here about the Global Slavery Index estimates that there are 45.8, nearly 46 million victims of slavery trafficking worldwide. Profits estimated to be in the region of 150 billion for the organisers, the perpetrators of these terrible crimes. In the UK, once again, just to show an example of the law, both these laws incidentally were introduced by Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the UK, so full marks to her, as well as to Justin Trudeau, but full marks to Theresa May. It's a good day to celebrate England in many respects, so I'll do it for our Prime Minister at the same time. The Modern Slavery Act of 2015, that if a person holds another in slavery or servitude, that they will be taken to task under the law. And the important thing about this law is the person ought to know that this is slavery, so it doesn't actually rely specifically on intent. If the person is involved in that process of trafficking, then they will be prosecuted. Because all too often people say, well, I didn't realise, I thought it was a legitimate company that I was doing work for, even though they might be aiding and abetting that taking place. Once again, Lifton's themes can be applied to trafficking very clearly with regard to high levels of control. Clearly the person feels owned. I mean, I think that notion that one person can own another should be wiped from history. And then for me, that's another way that we can define cultic control, coercive control across the board. Loading the language, it's all about the leader, it's all about the pimp, it's all about the business. That notion that people should have that unconditional loyalty, the notion that people should confess when they're not doing everything for the group, for the leader. The fact that work in that sense is everything, and that we're somehow on a special mission. And in that sense, again, the dispensing of existence is very clear. But the point I'm making is that we can use Lifton's theory of thought reform, we can use other theories and models to demonstrate the fact that this is part of that broader spectrum of coercive control that exists within groups, it exists within domestic relationships, it exists within trafficking. And it's all part of that overall phenomenon of oppression and coercion and the dispensing of existence and identity for the individual. The other area which ICSA has broadened out into, which Cultic Studies has embraced over many years now, and these are some very sad images of terrorist attacks around the world. And of course, just over a year ago in Greater Manchester, we were afflicted by a horrific attack on the Manchester Arena, where 22 young women and their parents, some of them lost their lives, when Salman Abedi walked in and exploded a bomb in the foyer of the Manchester Arena. Salman Abedi had been a student at the University of Salford, and it affected the communities in Manchester greatly, and we're still mourning those that were lost. And in that sense, that's the context of coercion in another way, how young people are being sucked into, not just young people, people more broadly, into extremist and radicalised movements. We had a panel at this conference on the rise, in that sense, both of the far right, and that's National Action from the UK, a fascist organisation, but also that's the demonstration in Charlottesville last year, and this notion of the alt-right, which somehow makes it sound just a little bit more acceptable than the far right. But we should be clear about what we're talking about. We're talking about fascism and Nazism in all its obnoxious forms. And the fact that in Europe we've seen the rise of the Law and Justice Party, PIS, in Poland, successive terms in office, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the official opposition, or the very fragile opposition, fragile government led by Angela Merkel, and then Salvini from the Northern League in Italy. I could go on with regard to Orban and others across Europe. So we've been making the case, of course, for many years that some cults are terrorist cults, some cults are terrorist groups. Not all are, and we know many cults, many extremist groups don't actually commit violent acts or terrorist acts, but some are. And we published in the predecessor journal to ICSA in 2006 a single edition specifically on terrorism. And in recent years, we've allied with the Radicalisation and Awareness Network in Europe, which is funded by the European Commission. And it specifically has a number of networks and working groups across Europe, all dedicated both to prevention of radicalisation, but also exit work. And it was on the issue of exit work that just back in May, we had the RAN Exit Academy in Rotterdam. And it was great that Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly were able to come over as keynote speakers, and we were able to share, like we did in Bordeaux in a joint meeting, the fact that we've had decades of experience, and some of those people in this room, of doing exit counselling from extremist groups. And in the Radicalisation Awareness Network, we have people who've also been working for a long time doing exit work from radicalised groups. And it's really great that we're sharing that knowledge and expertise. And in many respects, we're taking that to the next level. Because in Europe and in this country too, there's a real struggle. How do we extricate people, not just from Salafi jihadist extremist groups, but how do we extricate people from the far right? How do we get to the root cause of their alienation and identification with these obnoxious ideologies? And again, the definitions are worth revisiting. This is a definition from the Australian government around violent extremism, beliefs and actions of people who support or use violence to achieve ideological, religious or political goals. That's a quote from the Australian government definition, which is very much in line with the definitions within cultic studies that we've used within culture. The phenomenon of people embracing opinion, views and ideas which could lead to acts of terrorism from the European Commission. And then we have a definition from a number of years ago from ICSA, which is the goals of the group's leaders are the actual detriment to their members, their families or the community. And of course, that's the thing to recognise about terrorist organisations. The vast majority of the members don't commit terrorist attacks. They might aid and abet them, but actually their principal work is not that, but some do. And so the effect goes more broadly in that regard. And then Masood Banasada, a great writer within the cultic studies field, a charismatic leader, a doctrine, a cause or an ideology, isolation, psychological and or physical from wider society, just demonstrating that there is a commonality of definition from the terrorist studies field, from the radicalisation field and the cultic studies field. And what we've been doing, what a number of colleagues have been doing, Robert Dubrow, Christina Caparese, Håkan Java, others, and I've been part of with Linda in recent years too, is exploring and helping to understand that we're all, again, talking about that spectrum of coercive influence, that spectrum of destructive influence that leads people to commit these atrocities. And they're recruited in the same way as to cults, and the definition of cult is exactly applicable to those organisations as well. So what we end up with, as I said earlier on, across these different domains, across that spectrum, a number of overlapping terms and theories. And actually, as a great supporter of pluralism, I always was until I was recruited into my cult, and I was really pleased to go back to it years later. I think that's actually a really good thing. We don't have to argue over whether brainwashing is better than coercive control, or whether thought reform is better than mind control, or whether coercive persuasion is better than indoctrination. These are all parallel explanations. All the scholars that have developed them, I think, have done it for good reason, and the research backs up these terms. So we don't actually, in that sense, need to worry that these terms are there. They're not competing. They're different explanations of that singular phenomenon, which I prefer to use the term coercive control or persuasion to describe that, but I'm also comfortable, and I think there's a lot more evidence than there used to be for brainwashing as well. Particularly, we were talking yesterday about Paddy Hearst's case, and the fact that re-examining that case with the evidence that's now there for coercive control makes the case much more strongly to what happened to her specifically. And it's important to remember as well those definitions of thought reform programmes, and just to think about the way in which these apply across those contexts of coercive influence in family relationships, in trafficking, in gangs, in radicalised groups. And this programme of systematically destabilising a person's sense of self is often referred in domestic settings as gaslighting. It's the same process that people are afflicted to in these different situations. A new version of causality and reality, accepting a new worldview, and to turning the person into being a dependent on the organisation or the person. And we also have the definition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual to back this up in DSM-5 around other specified dissociative disorder. Look what it says: identity disturbance due to prolonged intense coercive persuasion. Individuals who've been subjected to intense coercive persuasion, example, brainwashing, thought reform, indoctrination, while captive, torture, long-term political imprisonment, recruitment by sects and cults. It's in that. It's in DSM-5. It has been for a number of years. So I think sometimes it's easy, given the proliferation of terms and the fact that the cult word is sometimes controversial, to then think, well, actually, we've not made the inroads that actually we have been making. Because Evan Stark uses our language. They use that language to explain the horrifying phenomenon of trafficking. It's used to explain radicalisation, and it's in DSM-5. And as a psychologist, as long as it's in DSM-5, then it's really fine. But at the same time, it's actually really important that it is in there. I, in my own small way, have tried to bring that together with regard to the totalistic identity theory, how people get trapped psychologically either with the extremist group, the cult, the dominant partner, the leader, the pimp, again across that spectrum of coercive control. Psychologically, people are trapped. There is no way out psychologically and physically as well, but psychologically, because the trick is that you feel you're doing it for the person and the person is part of you, or you're doing it for the group and the group is that dominant part of you. And Lifton was right to describe it as totalism, and all I've done in the minor way is to update that, but to do it through cognitive psychology, to look at the way in which psychologically people are trapped. I think it's important in this conference as we close to think about what we can do about this spectrum of coercive control. It can seem, particularly when you lay it all out like that, to be quite overwhelming. What can we do? And certainly I felt like that when hearing about the statistics on trafficking yesterday. And we've got to change that context. We've got to get to the roots of these things. But it's also important to recognise what is already being done, but also then what else can be done as well. And this is by ICSA, but it's also by many other organisations around the world, some of whom are represented here today as well. And that's prevention work to prevent recruitment and entrapment, and understanding vulnerability factors, I point there vulnerability assessment framework in the UK. The really important work around exit work and counselling for individuals, families and communities, and recovery and rehabilitation work that this organisation and many within it and others too have been doing over many years. The importance of interfaith work, actually reaching out to communities, and spiritual outreach, which ICSA has been doing for many years. The importance of doing community-based grassroots work that actually is all about building cohesive communities, overcoming the alienation step by step that people are facing that lead people towards violence and extremism and being recruited into groups or relationships of that nature. Supporting families in the terrifically difficult job building an authentic set of relationships within a family and building nurturance, then as part of that wider community. The important focus and support on children and young people who've grown up in abusive groups, but also in abusive families and relationships, and how people can be helped to build their lives after that. And the importance as well of education within the school system, but also in universities and in communities more widely, and the importance in that sense of community-based education where there are no barriers to involvement. The training of professionals, which is critical, in which ICSA has played an important role and is doing more, particularly with the CE credit work, and also research and evaluation, where now, 20 years down the line for me, but also nearly 10 years into the journal, I don't think we've ever had a strong evidence base for the phenomenon of coercive control, coercive persuasion, thought reform, and that evidence is there for people to use in legal settings to get justice, but also to work out how we can prevent that moving forward. And that's the great thing about the awareness building through ICSA Today websites, and also hopefully as well, because we're very 21st century now, the development of apps for smartphones as well. I'll finish with this. I wanted to talk about the spectrum of coercive control, and I want to leave with a positive thought about the fact that we have in our power, I believe, over the years ahead, to create a society, to create communities where oppression and alienation, the roots of coercive persuasion, of coercive control, of cults and abuse in relationships and families, doesn't have to be the fabric of our lives, where we can actually, in creative commons of pluralism, have all of us, and many more besides this room, and across communities in a myriad of different ways, create the circumstances, the context in which people can grow up having respect. And it brings us back to the wonderful remarks of Lorna Goldberg at the beginning of this conference, that we have that power to change the world anew. And I finished with this quote from Robert F. Kennedy. He was actually quoting a researcher of ancient Greece when he said, "Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and to make gentle the life of this world." And I believe we can do that in small ways. There are organisations that do that in small ways, like the order of the teaspoon in Sweden, the teaspoon being the metaphor. You don't need a big spoon, you don't need a ladle, you can do it in small ways every day. In my 20 years of coming to these conferences, I know that ICSA does that in many, many ways. So do all of you in different organisations you work in. And it's really important that we take that message of hope out, I think, to communities that are affected by coercive control across that spectrum, and say we can change that context and we can create a world anew. It doesn't have to be this way, and we have knowledge and evidence on our side like we've had never before to make sure that that happens. So thank you all for listening.